All right. So let's switch gears a bit, and as opposed to talking about the general aspects of the family system, talk about how families manage stressor events that they encounter in their lives. And so that involves what we call family stress theory. And it's really kind of the focus of this course, because I'm asking you as your paper to actually look at how families respond to their environments and the stressors that are present there. And so these models, we'll see the family stress theory kind of gives us a framework for thinking about the stressor event that families are facing, the kinds of challenges those events then make for family organization, and then what are the characteristics of families that help them respond to that stressor event in a way that they're able to continue to function properly. So when we get to that part about what is it about family organization that allows them to respond well, we're going to see that we can bring in everything we've talked about so far. And so the family models, systems models, and the family culture ideas are both going to factor into understanding what makes a family better able to respond to stressor events. And so let's start off. We'll start off with some definitional issues, and then we'll talk about the contextual model of family stress and the double ABCX model of family stress. And then, actually, I'm going to do this. We're talking about definitional models. I'm sorry, not the contextual model of family stress, the adaptation model of family stress, and the double ABCX model. And then the next lecture, we'll talk about the contextual model of family stress. Okay, first, definitions. What is stress? We all have it, right? What is stress? Just generally, what do you think of stress? You can either use stress in a physical sense, stress on a table, stress on a plate of glass, or you could use stress in a mental sense. What is stress?
Oh, I think of, I don't know, like anxiety comes to my brain. Like,
anxiety.
Pressure, I don't know, pressure, anxiety to...
So what's anxiety about? And what happens in anxiety?
Well, for me, it's like freak out, but
Okay, no, freak out. What does freak out mean?
To lose control, to just go...
To lose control, right?
Yeah.
To not to be able to do anything, right?
Yeah.
I just got a letter from Revenue Canada. It's just a regular, they want to check on your records for your tax return. Stress, I can't do anything, right? I don't want to even, the letter's sitting over there. Did I do something wrong?
It's awful.
Right? So that's some of it, right? Like, you're prohibited from functioning.
Mm-hmm.
At least in the psychological sense, right? Any other ideas?
I guess, well, that's just like an individual point of view, but like stress between people, like for...
Okay.
I know, I don't know how, like between me and my dad right now, there's a lot of like stress between us, like confrontation, like conflict, like you can see it when we talk, or even that we're very like withheld and whatnot.
Things aren't operating up to norm, right? You're holding back.
Yeah, like you can, like tension, like if there was a string there, you just like, you barely have to nick it.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, things are at their point of losing integrity, right?
Yeah.
You're holding on by a
thread.
A thread.
I'm dangling. I'm dangling.
Right. But stress in a plate of glass, or like glass pane. You push on it and push on it and push on it, right? And it gets to a point where the more you push on it, it's not going to give. And pretty soon it's going to start or you get a chip in your windshield, right? It puts stress in your windshield, and all of a sudden it
grows legs.
Mine's like
or becomes a star or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Because you created stress in the system. Plexiglass doesn't get stressed as much, does it? You can bend it, it's not going to break, it's flexible, right? And so bridges. Sometimes bridges fall down into the river that they're spanning, right?
The one.
The one in Mount Vernon, not necessarily the one in Mount Vernon, but the one in Minnesota a few years ago that just collapsed. What happened? Well, over time, the weight and the inferiority of the metal, the weight put stress on the metal, and the metal started to lose its integrity, and it stopped functioning, right? That's the general idea of stress. And so what we want to do is take that and apply it to a family. So what's a family stress? If psychological stress is having anxiety and not being able to function, not being able to think straight, not being able to put thoughts into action. If relationship stress is not being able to communicate and interact with another person, what's family stress? Well, it's pressure. Boss says it's pressure or tension in a family system, a disturbance of the family's steady state. And it's inferred from observations of the functioning of the system. So just like we would say, you're obviously under stress. Came late to class today, you normally do your work and you're not getting it done. What's going on? You're experiencing stress because you're not doing your work, right? You're not functioning. If someone walked into your home and you were fighting with your dad, they would know that you're fighting with your dad, and you wouldn't even have to fight with your dad, right? They would see it in the interactions. They would say, that's not normal. That's not typical. There's something going on there, right? And so we're going to do the same thing for the family as a whole. Lowered performance of routines and tasks. Things don't get done. Expectations aren't fulfilled. And to some degree, we're going to use secondary indicators to know that the family is under stress, and that's physical or emotional symptoms of family members. So the stress that you're experiencing in your head because you've got something that you're worried about has a secondary component of creating anxiety. And so your anxiety is a sign that your system, your psychological system, is under stress. It's not the stress itself, but it's a symptom of that stress. And so we can talk about families in the same way. Families have stress to the extent that they have lowered performance of routines and tasks. And we often know that they're under stress, that they're experiencing stress, because one of the things that doesn't get done is, because it's not functioning properly at the systems level, is that the individual systems within it start to dysfunction as well. Right? Every system of families is a system containing individual systems. And those individual systems can't function unless that context that they're in is functioning properly. And so stress is going to actually be the lack of performance of routines and tasks, the inability of the family to operate, or operating at a very lowest possible level. And we can use individuals' behaviors as an indicator that a family might be under stress. Now, the emotional symptoms or behavioral symptoms of family members in and of themselves don't constitute family stress. Though that's individual stress. But we use that as an indicator that the family itself might be under stress. System stress at the family level is the system not functioning properly. Does that make sense to you? Make that distinction? We've been talking all along of the family as a system. We're not so concerned about individuals or understanding the stress in individuals. We only care about that to the extent that it's informing us of maybe there's something going on at the system level. And then we would have to go and look at those families to see what the nature of that stress was in the family system. It's not the individual's behaviors that's the stress, it's something else about the way they're relating to each other. Stress can be good or it can be bad. So if you're under stress right now in your relationship with your father, it's probably a good thing. Maybe this is a transformation of your relationship with your father that needs to be done. It might be necessary. Now, it would be best if it wasn't severe, if the relationship can make a shift. But usually, systems tend to develop a pattern that they want to keep in place. They want to sustain, they want to have morphostasis. That's their tendency. They don't like to change. And so it takes usually a lot to get them to move and change. Not all families. Some are more change-focused than others. But people feel comfortable, and the organization tends to work if there's a pattern that gets reproduced over time without having to be renegotiated, if everything falls into place. And so we generally systems are going to tend to resist stress or change unless they have to. And so when something changes in the environment, either something changes in the individuals who are members of the family, or something changes outside the family that's putting pressure on that system as it's organized, then that creates the stress. And then hopefully the family is capable of responding in a way that the stress doesn't become too severe, and then it changes. And when it changes, hopefully it changes in a direction that accommodates the new reality. And so it adapts and it becomes something different. And so stress is good in that case. It changes it into a direction that it needs to change because the circumstances of life have changed. And again, there's always two sources of stress or variation in families. One is the individual members and the changes that they experience as they grow and develop, and the other is changes in the environment that the family is in. So temporary stress can lead to adaptation and survival. Change and growth often involve some level of stress. Okay. Chronic stress, on the other hand, can undermine the system. If it's ongoing stress, if the family never actually changes and just sort of copes and gets by, so we take a relationship of a daughter with her father as an example again, if it just stays that way, you could see that it could sit there as this tightly woven piece that's about to break, but continues into the future that way. That's not good for the system because nothing else will develop, because it's constantly just trying to keep itself together as opposed to develop and becoming something bigger and better. And the same is true for families. If the stress is always there and there's nothing done to change the way the family is organized so that the stress goes away, then it just builds and builds and builds, and eventually the stress gets bigger and bigger and breaks the system. Extreme stress can lead to family crisis, and that's a disturbance so overwhelming, pressure so severe, or change so acute that the family system is blocked, immobilized, and incapacitated. So family crisis is a stage in which things aren't getting done, but no, this is more than things aren't getting done. The family is starting to fall apart. People are going different directions. So family stress theory is all about how different kinds of events can contribute to creating stress, how family organization and other aspects of families as a system are more or less capable of responding to those unique elements of those events, and whether or not that response can lower stress or whether it winds up not being able to address the stress and thereby experiencing crisis. So how do you prevent families from experiencing crisis? Again, family stress theory uses what we call a homeostatic model of stress and crisis, also called the roller coaster model. And it perceives a family as functioning at a certain level. There's a certain degree of organization to it. A hierarchy of roles, an organization of subsystems with boundaries, all the characteristics that we talked about when we talked about what a family system is. Then, Number two, some event occurs. A child is born with a disability. A father has a heart attack. Okay? Child is in a serious accident. Someone dies. What happens? Disorganization, potentially. That disorganization then needs to be responded to. And so when families, in other words, it can't function the same way. It's trying to do things the way it always was, but it can't, because the circumstances are such that that organization no longer works. And so it loses organization, becomes more chaotic. The ties oftentimes become less strong. And then it experiences a turning point and it tries to recover. Oh, we need to fix it. We've got conflict. How do we get rid of the conflict? We need to change the way we do things in order to accommodate this situation. And if it's successful, it recovers. So 4 is a period of recovery. And then 5 is a new level of organization. Now, in some cases, the family might be able to return to doing things the way they used to do things. Other times, whatever this event was may have made that organization impossible even going forward, that you can't recover from it. So a husband having a heart attack, or a breadwinner having a heart attack, well, surgery and recovery period of time, that person can go back and pretty much function as they did before in the family. They can resume their work, etc. Okay? And so they might go back to what they were before. Other times, it might not work at all. Here's how we worked in terms of working as a family with a child. And now we have a new child who has a disability. Well, we can't make the assumptions we made before. We can't organize our role relationships the way we did before. We can't even think about the ways in which our children are going to be related to each other as we thought we would be able to, given our current family model. And so we need to change. We need to become more complex. We might need to bring other people in, make them part of our family life, increase our ties, open our boundaries, maybe, and that might require a lot more management of those boundaries. We might become a more complex system, or we might become simplified. We might try to keep it all simple, reduce our goals, focus on the child, make sure the child gets through this, etc. And so we might make things simpler. The idea of what's a higher or lower level of organization is a difficult one in this model. It's not always crystal clear. But you could think of organization as the degree to which there's a complexity of the relationships and the members of the family that are incorporated. So if you have a simple boundary and there's not many people who come and go across, it's simple. If you've got a boundary of your family where you've got lots of people coming and going and they're integrated into everyday family life, you've got to coordinate nurses and grandparents, that's a more complex organization, right? If you have more rules, it's a more complex organization. And so that would be the difference here. So this is what's called the homeostatic model of stress and crisis. It assumes that families operate at a pretty fixed level of organization over time and only change as a result of some event, some stressor event. And then that change is a change that reflects whatever the new demands are of that stressor event. This is the heart at the foundation of family stress models. Now, having said that, I don't want to overemphasize how stable this period is. That in all likelihood, it's more of a dynamic process, not a fixed organization. That families are probably changing almost constantly their organization over time, even without any major stressor event. Or at least that there's variation in families. That some families are very rigid and they sustain a given organization over time without changing, and others are more flexible. And so we think of Olson's model. first level adaptability, remember? First level adaptability is basically what's going on here, everyday life. Are they rigid or are they flexible? Then, second order adaptability is what happens when something hits here that prevents either this rigid pattern or even this flexible pattern from going forward without change. And that causes disorganization. That's where communication comes in and reestablishing a new level of organization. Again, probably either rigid or, again, more flexible over time at a first level adaptability. So, as I've hinted at, the model of family stress and adaptation is the first model of family stress, and that says family adjustment and adaptation response model says that family functioning is a state of balance in demands and capabilities in interaction with family meanings. So there's three elements in the family stress and adaptation model. Okay? You look at what are the demands of the stressor event. So what are the demands that fall upon a family when a member is deployed overseas? What are the demands placed on a family when they lose their home in a hurricane? What are the demands that are placed on a family when a child gets sick or a child is born with a disability? Okay? What are those special demands? What is it? What challenges do these events pose for family functioning? So you imagine a deployed spouse. Well, what if the deployed spouse has been designated as a role as disciplinarian or teacher or whatever role he has or she has? How's the family going to adjust to that? Does it have what it needs to be able to switch its organization to accommodate the new demand that is brought about by this event? So that refers to the capabilities. What's available? What are the skills of the members? What are their knowledge base? What is their emotional capacities to handle these kinds of separations? And then also at the family level, is it a flexible organization? Does it have a lot of cohesion? Those things are going to play a role. Does it have clear boundaries? Think of all of those things we talked about when we looked at the family models, systems models. Those all fall under the category of capabilities. What's this family capable of? And is it matching what the demand is asking it to do? And then finally, this all takes place within a context of family meanings. How does the family react and think about the event? What meanings do they attach to it? How do they see themselves, regardless of their capacities? Do they see themselves as having those capacities? Those perceptions can make a big difference in terms of what actions it takes or doesn't take. Maybe it becomes frozen in time because it just thinks that this is impossible. We can never recover. Well, that kind of thinking, what we call catastrophic thinking, isn't going to help, right? And so we have to think about the family meanings as well. They're an important part of the puzzle. So the demands, they can be normative and normative stressors, usually discrete events. So a normative stressor might be the birth of a first child. A normative stressor would be the first child goes to high school and becomes an adolescent. A normative stressor is the first child goes off to college. These are things that happen to everybody, to all families, right? They're still stressor events. Every family still has to deal with it. But in some ways they might be easier to deal with, right? Because other people have done it, you kind of have a sense of what it's involved, it's kind of legitimate. Others are non-normative events, non-normative stressors, like someone gets arrested, someone gets sick with a special disease that no one has ever experienced before in the family history. So these are discrete events. Another kind of demand is ongoing family strains. These are unresolved tensions that exist in families. And so the longer your relationship with your dad goes on, that becomes an ongoing demand on the rest of the family, right? I don't know. How are we going to deal with this?
Who do we have to avoid today?
Who do we have to avoid today? And daily hassles, minor disruptions of everyday life. So, sometimes the bill doesn't get paid. We've got to fix that. How do we deal with that, right? Sometimes, I don't know, someone's late with their paycheck, or sometimes someone gets sick, but it's not a serious illness that's ongoing. So daily hassles are ongoing demands. Capabilities are tangible and psychosocial resources, or what we call individual statuses. How much money do we have? How much knowledge do we have amongst us? These are all kinds of tangible and psychosocial resources. What's our emotional intelligence of the family members? Do we have a lot of people who don't have the capacity to deal with change? Do we have people who are smart, intelligent, knowledgeable? These would all fall in here. And then coping behaviors, and this refers to the family processes that characterize the family at the time that they experience these demands. So here we're talking about, we could use Beaver's system model to characterize the family coping behaviors or their family dynamic. We could use, so we could talk about contextual clarity of the organization. We could talk about the clarity of boundaries. We could talk about the affective responsiveness. All of these are family dynamic processes that are going to facilitate the family's ability to deal with the demands that they're facing. Could be related to achieving tasks, or it could be more generally just sort of surviving. And so we could also talk about cohesion and flexibility in Olson's model as a capability. And then finally is family meanings. And this is the definition of the demands and capabilities. How do we see this event? For example, is it catastrophic? Is it fate? Is it something that is easy to deal with? Is it something that we've seen before, or that we have some knowledge about? And then also, how do we define our own capabilities? Are we a competent family? And that relates then to identity as a unit. What is our perceived competence? How cohesive are we? And then a worldview, significance of family beyond its boundaries. Does this mean that we no longer have a purpose if it's disrupted our family life? Or is there something bigger that we're trying to sustain by being a family? Because that can provide the motivation. All of these factor into really the motivation to actually do something, to take these capabilities and apply them and do the work to meet the demand. If you perceive the situation, the demand, in certain ways, it's going to incapacitate you, no matter what your potentials are for dealing with it. Because you have that perception of the demand, you're not going to put into place the changes that are necessary. If you think if you have a pretty good idea of what the demand is, but you don't think that you're very good at what you do, you don't have confidence, you're also not going to face that demand. And so this is the idea of family meaning. So demands, capabilities, and meanings. Now that fits into another model, which is a model, what's called the ABCX model. And this is the one that we're going to work the most with. And I'm going to show you how it relates to the other model. So the ABCX model is a process model. And so the ABC-X is taking us from the stressor event, which is A, to X, which is going to be stress and crisis. And so the A is the initiating stressor event, and this is in the other model we call family demands. The type of event has implications for perceptions, resources, and the likelihood of experiencing crisis. So every type of event is different and will place different sets of demands on the system. To some degree, some of the same things are going to make families adapt to these different stressors, but we have to start with what are the challenges that these families face that are unique to them. There are two conditional factors then that determine whether or not the A leads to the X, and that's why the B and C are in the middle. So these are the conditional variables. Okay? So A is an event that can or cannot cause X, stress. What's going to determine whether it does or doesn't? The B and the C. So the two conditional factors are family resources, capabilities, in the other model, traits, characteristics, or abilities of the individual members, the system, and the community that can be used to meet the demands of a stressor event. So what do you have available to you? What are the capabilities of the individuals who are in the family? What are the nature of the family dynamic and interactions? And what's available in the environment outside the family that you can rely upon to help you respond to the event? And that will make a big difference in whether or not you are able to respond in a way that you avoid the stress or crisis. So things like wealth, education, the organization of the family, support networks, all of those play a role. So wealth and education are coming from the individual, organization is the family, system and support networks reflect the things available in the community. And then perceptions are the family meanings in the other model, and this is the way in which stressor event, the context, and the family is collectively defined and perceived. And so we talk about a sense of coherence. Do we see ourselves as a family? Do we understand what we are as a family and what the nature of our relationships are? That's a sense of coherence. Do we have integrity, or are we falling apart? And then perceptions of risk and uncertainty. Do we see that this is really scary? Do we see that there isn't a clear avenue? Or do we perceive that we can organize ourselves around a set of principles? We can take the problem and break it down and actually calculate what would be appropriate actions to resolve the problem. If we think that it's too uncertain, if it's too risky, then we don't know how to behave. And we're going to be in trouble in those circumstances. And so perceptions can play a role. It's, again, perceptions of the demand and perceptions of who we are, and even perceptions of what our place is in the community. Is anybody going to help us? Or do we have to do it on our own? X is the stress, so different stressors. Stressor is an occurrence that could provoke change, different from the routine changes within a system that are expected as part of its regular, ordinary operation. So a stressor is different than stress. A stressor is the thing that can or may or may not create stress, but it has the capacity to do so. So we need to make that distinction, because all families experience stressors, but not all families experience stress. The stress is going to depend upon the B and the C, the resources and perceptions. Some types of stressors, so we can break down stressor events and get a sense of how easy or difficult they will be to respond to based upon their characteristics. And one way of thinking about stressors is to distinguish between internal and external stressors. An internal stressor is something that's putting pressure on the family system from the inside. In other words, something changing in the members of the family, in one or more members. So a person going through adolescence, that's a stressor event, big time. An individual getting sick and not being able to fill their roles, that's a stressor event. That's an internal stressor. An external stressor is something that's coming from the outside. A flood, an earthquake, an economic recession, causing pressure on the family to be able to organize itself around saving money to achieve its goals, right? And so if it's an external stressor, you would think, which one do you think would be easier for a family to respond to?
External.
Why?
Because it's not like a problem with the family as a system. It's like how they adapt to that. It's not like they're not breaking from the inside out. They're being attacked, I guess.
They could remove themselves from the environment they're in some situations, I guess.
which would make external maybe easier. Probably, I would argue the internal are easier. I'm sorry, the internal are more difficult. The external are easier. And partially because the internal means, if it's an internal stressor, it means something's going wrong with a member. And so that immediately reduces capacity, capability, right? And one of the important things is capability. Also, there's a sense that the family could become blamed for that individual's incapacitation or change. And so, in terms of perceptions, if you start blaming yourself, then you're not going to be able to make an appropriate response. If it's an external stressor, you have your full complement of members and their resources that they can provide. You could move away, get out from under it, and because it's coming from outside, no one in the family is responsible for it. It's fate, it's God, it's the economy, it's, we just have to deal with it. It's an unanticipated event that came from the outside. And so that's likely to result in stronger perceptions of integrity as a family, a sense of coherence. We know that social systems, when they're attacked from the outside, what do? They tend to pull together, and that increases the cohesion, which is an important resource, family organizational resource, capacity that they can utilize to respond. So ability to defer responsibility and unite against a common threat, and the potential in an internal stressor, the potential for a buildup of stresses due to reduced capabilities. And so internal stresses should be more difficult to deal with than externals for these two reasons. If it's external, you can defer responsibilities and you don't have, and unite together. And then if it's an internal stressor, it's more difficult because of the buildup of stresses due to reduced capabilities. Normative versus non-normative. Okay, I kind of gave you an example already, right? A normative stressor event is something that happens to most families. It's something that most people would say that's expected. That's a sign of you're just going through what families go through. These are changes that happen all the time. And so if it's normative, and then you also can anticipate when they're going to happen. And so you can prepare yourself for them, right? So the transition to childhood is a stressor event. It's a big-time stressor event. But it's a normative stressor event. Most families go through it. And so the couple going through it has advantages. The community that they're involved in can provide them lots of insights into how to deal with this situation. They can anticipate that it's going to happen, and they can do what we call anticipatory socialization. They can prepare themselves, learn what it means to be a parent, read up on books and things of that nature to prepare for it. And when it happens, the community is going to be like, this is great, this is a good thing, keep moving, go forward, right? So there's all that encouragement that happens, and lots of resources will funnel in because the whole system is set up to make it easier, because it's part of the normative aspects of day-to-day life. If it's non-normative, it's something like someone gets arrested or thrown in, incarcerated, or someone loses their job. Well, unemployment is something that, well, while it might happen to a lot of people in a time of economic recession, it's not something that people say, well, there's the period of unemployment in your life, right? So it's not considered to be a normative event. It's a non-normative event in that people don't anticipate that it's going to happen to them. There is no set of procedures and guidelines for how to deal with it. And it happens suddenly. And it's also considered to be, at least in our society, an illegitimate status. Right? That you did something wrong. If you got unemployed, it's your fault. Right? That you didn't follow the rules properly. After all, people who are functioning individuals in society and who are socialized properly and know how to do good work, they don't get fired. Even if that's not true, unemployment is lacking in legitimacy. And so it's going to be more difficult for you to handle that kind of transition because not only have you lost your job, but it's going to be hard for you to outreach to other people to get their help. And people aren't going to know how to help you. There's nothing built in to help you deal with that situation. And so those kinds of stresses are going to be more difficult. So these reflect normative versus non-normative, the degree of preparation and understanding of the event, and the degree of legitimacy in the community. So another kind of stressor, type of stressor event, besides the two that we've looked at thus far, is whether or not the stressor is clear or ambiguous. So some stressors, you know exactly what the source of the problem is. Other times you don't know the source of the problem. Okay? So one clear stressor would be someone lost their job. Okay, they lost their job, you know what the stressor is. It's causing problems in the family because there's lack of income. The person probably feels like less of a person because they define themselves in terms of their job. So you kind of know what the source of the problem is, and you can try to address that problem because you know what it is. Sometimes, however, those stresses are more ambiguous, and that might be a case where someone is developing a psychological problem, a case of depression, for example. And the depression may go on for quite a long time without anybody ever recognizing that it's there. Or ADHD is another example of these kinds of more ambiguous kinds of stressor events. Oftentimes it has to do with mental illness, although sometimes it could be a physical illness as well, something that draws away from the energies of the person so they're not fulfilling their roles. There's a lot of good study of some of the treatments for certain kinds of diseases that create personality changes because people are taking a drug. And that drug creates a personality change, and nobody's aware that there's a personality change going on. And so that disrupts the normal ebb and flow of family life, and you don't know what the problem is. And so you can't really address it, and you wind up taking actions that are inappropriate for dealing with the problem. And so whether it's clear or ambiguous really determines the ability to address problems efficiently and avoid counterproductive changes. Again, military deployment would be a pretty clear one, right? A child with a disability, usually pretty clear, unless it's a disability that's not diagnosed. Whether the stressor is volitional versus non-volitional is another dimension of the stressor event that can make recovering from the stress or adapting to it, the situation, more or less difficult. So a volitional stressor would be something that you choose to do as a family, and it creates disruption. A non-volitional one is you didn't make the choice yourself. So you can think of a volitional stressor.
Sorry, for the volitional, you're saying like as a family you decide, or
Yeah.
like one?
Or the head of the family makes that decision. I mean, it's more fully volitional if there's full endorsement of the decision. If one person makes the decision and the rest of them aren't on board with it, then it's not quite as volitional, right? But usually the person, when we take a fully volitional kind of event, it would be one which a member or decides and the rest of the family agrees this is what is best for us, or as a group, the family decides this is what we're going to do.
Do you want an example?
Yeah.
Maybe like deciding to move?
Yeah, deciding to move. Or to take a new job in another location. These would be, that would be a kind of volitional stressor. My family has moved a lot. We've chosen to endure periods of separation for months in order that we might pursue certain kinds of goals that we have as a family and as individuals. And so we went to Africa, and I went first for 4 months, and then my wife came for 3 months. So that separation was hard, but it was easier because it was a decision that we engaged in. Or my wife now works in another city, in another country. And so we go back and forth, and there's a lot of stressors there, but it was a decision that we made jointly. We moved to Switzerland. My family's done this a lot. I have lots of examples of volitional stressors. You say, well, why do you do that to yourself? Because it is a stressor. It is a disruption of general patterns and routines that requires some adjustment, some flexibility. Once you make volitional choices like this and you get through them, you're probably going to be able to handle more stressors down the road. So it's not why we did these things, was to achieve our goals, our personal and our group goals, our family goals. And because it was something that we chose and that we saw it as part of achieving our goals, it was a lot easier to manage it. We were much more flexible in what we demanded of each other, etc. So if it's a volitional, there's a greater degree of consensus about the event and the need for changes to accommodate the new demands that you're experiencing. And there's a greater perception of family as controlling its own destiny, as opposed to being the subject of fate. Now, if I feel I control my own destiny, then it tends to propel me towards action to address the situation that's confronting me. If I feel as though, oh my God, someone else is shaping my destiny, then I'm less likely to take a more proactive approach to managing my life. I'm probably going to sit back and just sort of cope with the situation as best I can, not thinking that I can make a change myself. Fate's going to interfere anyway. Fifth type of stressor distinction is between acute versus chronic. So acute is one point in time. It has a beginning, it has an end. A chronic stressor is something that doesn't have any beginning, end, or you never know when it's going to end. It just keeps on going and going and going. So what would be an acute stressor versus a chronic one?
Like, would chronic be like constant alcoholism in the same way?
Chronic would be a case of alcoholism. Yeah, that would be a chronic stressor. Yes.
So then, like, acute could be like if someone's temporarily out of a job?
Yes, if it was a temporary situation.
Yeah, like knowing, like going in, you don't know it's temporary, but
right.
If it turns out to be temporary.
Well, someone loses their job. Someone loses their job. It initially is an acute stressor. How are we going to adjust to this new scenario? And hopefully, if you recover from that, then it goes away. And there's a sense that people don't stay unemployed forever, that they do get a job eventually, or they find another way of managing the family without that job. It could become chronic, however, if there's a massive recession like we just experienced and someone stays out of the job for well beyond what would be normally expected. So whether it's acute or chronic determines the potential clarity of the source, progression, and conclusion of the stressor event. You know what the source is, you know what's going to happen, you know how it's going to progress, you have a pretty good sense of that, and you know that it's going to end, and you have a sense of when that ending is going to happen. If it's a chronic, there's a greater potential for buildup of stressors over time. That what's going to happen is you've got this thing going on. Let's take alcoholism. And so that stressor, if it doesn't go away, the family might cope with it in some way, but it never resolves the source of the stressor. And as a result, when new things come along that are stressors, they become bigger issues than they would have otherwise have been. And so you get what's called the accumulation of stress in the family. We're barely hanging on, dealing with this alcoholic member. Now, the breadwinner loses his or her job. Well, to some degree, maybe they lost their job because their life was just, they're trying to cope with this alcoholic parent and they didn't go to work enough, and so they didn't perform well because home life was so ritualized around trying to keep this other person from being a full participant and disrupting things otherwise. And so now they lose their job, and losing their job makes it even more difficult to recover from that because they've been weakened by a family structure that is, as we talked last time, straining, right? It's barely getting by. And so now that becomes a much bigger issue. Or it could even be just a normal developmental event. So you're dealing with an alcoholic member and a child goes to school for the first time or becomes an adolescent and goes to high school for the first time. Oh, now you've got to deal with all these new demands and you've still got issues going on because of the alcoholism, because of the chronic stressor. And so those issues never get resolved either, and they just pile up. And so we call it something called the accumulation or the pileup of stressors. And it's a frequent thing that happens in families when they're confronted with a stressor event that they're not recovering from, that they're not, as we're going to see in a minute, adapting to. You're going to kind of see that a little bit in the movie that you're going to watch, Ordinary People, for your assignment. Another distinction is between cumulative versus isolated stressor events. Existing stress or coping mechanisms reduce the capabilities of families to respond to new stressors. So a cumulative stressor event is one that comes after a whole series of other stressor events have happened just prior to it. And so you get an accumulation. If you experience a stressor at a time when you've got other things going on, that makes it a cumulative stressor event. That's more difficult to recover from, as opposed to an isolated event where it's more clearly identified and adjusted to. Oftentimes, if you're dealing with some other issue, you don't even see the stressor event impacting you. You're so focused on dealing with what you've got going on a regular basis that you can't see the problems that are arising in other areas because you're dedicating so much attention to managing that other stressor event. Okay, so that's the ABCX model. Later, Pauline Boss, who developed that model, later Pauline Boss, who worked with that model, develops a more complicated version of it, which she calls the contextual ABCX model. Okay, so it's not very complicated, it's not that complicated, but I'll walk you through it. And so this diagram shows how it operates. Inside, she's got the ABCX. Okay? She's got the event or situation, the nature of the stressor event, A. She's got B, the resources available to deal with that stressor event. She's got C, the perceptions of the event and the perceptions of the resources, and also the perception of the context. And then she has X, which is low or high degree of stress or crisis. And so, as you can see in this model, basically the model itself is what determines whether A leads to X. Okay? What's going to be important is perceptions and resources. They're going to make the determination. If you have sufficient resources and the correct resources, and you have the right perceptions of yourself as a family and of the situation that you're confronting, then that's going to reduce the likelihood that A leads to X. If you have the wrong or inadequate resources and you have the wrong perceptions, it's going to increase the likelihood of experiencing X, either high stress or crisis. The situation, however, also determines whether and what kind of perceptions you're likely to have, as well as the situation might affect your resources. Remember, we talked about how if a member if it's an internal stressor event, right? Well, one of the things about an internal stressor event is that there's something wrong with one of the members. That's the stressor event. Well, if there's something wrong with one of the members, then that's diminished the resources of the family to deal with it, right? And so the event, we're interested in, does the event cause or lead to X? Not cause, but lead to X. However, we have to recognize that the event is also simultaneously shaping the resources that are going to be important for whether or not the family experiences the stress. or the event is likely to alter the perceptions. Some events might lead to unclear perceptions about what's wrong because they're ambiguous stressor events. So the type of stressor event is going to shape, to some degree, the perceptions and the resources available, which are then going to also be important for determining whether or not the event leads to X. Can you follow this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
I think so. So it's like if you're saying the event happens and then it alters like the perceptions and the family resources, and then that's where the middle like down and upward X goes to, because A affects both of those and it depends on how much it affects it, and then where they meet in the middle or depends on which kind of direction. Okay.
So, but the fundamental thing of interest is what determines whether A leads to X? And it's going to be how perceptions and resources, what are available.
Okay.
What kind of available resources you have, what kind of perceptions you have. It's just that we have to recognize that those perceptions and resources are also being fundamentally changed by the event itself. Okay. Now, so that's the basic model. Then she says, okay, the event, the perceptions, and the resources, and for that matter, this crisis or stress that's experienced, is shaped by two contexts. The internal context and the external context. Now, she hasn't drawn any arrows in here, but you could essentially draw an arrow that the internal context of the family is shaping the perceptions and shaping the resources. Just like the external context is shaping the perceptions and shaping the resources. And so when she talks about this model, the context is what's really important, because the context is what is determining the B and the C in particular. So let's look at what these contexts are. The internal context has three elements, which she labels structural, psychological, and philosophical. The external context has 5 elements: culture, history, economy, development, and heredity. Okay. Now, so the internal context is something about the members and their relationships with each other and the kind of culture that they form as a family. The external context is about everything that precedes the family, hereditary background, for example, that might shape the characteristics of the members, but is something that those members can't easily change, part of their heredity. Having a certain kind of gene that might be increase a proclivity for a cancer or the likelihood of developing alcoholism. Okay? And so external contexts will shape some of the internal context as well as shape perceptions and resources more directly. So let's break down the different elements of the two contexts and hopefully can show how this works a little more clearly. So the internal context has 3 elements: structural, psychological, and philosophical. So when she talks about the structural internal context, she's talking about family system characteristics. So what would she be talking about there?
How the family interacts with each other?
Yeah.
Like their rituals and stuff like that?
Possibly.
Okay.
Oh, I think she probably rituals maybe tie it into here,
Okay.
but I think she's talking more. I guess we could put rituals in there.
I didn't even read the part, sorry.
Uh-huh.
I didn't read the philosophical one yet.
That's okay.
So I said it.
The structural, but
Jumping
you're on the right ground. You're talking about the ways in which the members interact with each other, and ritual is part of that. So ritual has symbolic significance, which would, as we'll see in a minute, kind of put it in the philosophical side of the house. But it also has dynamics of interaction between members, and so that's part of the structure. Oh, let's put rituals in there. What else would you put in the structural?
As far as like roles and whatnot, like
Okay, so
I guess who's the head of the household, or like what roles each individual.
okay, we got 2 things there:
Hierarchical.
power and control, hierarchical relationships, or less hierarchical relationships. We have roles, And so what were the terms that we used to capture the idea of roles?
Gender, sex oriented? No. Doesn't
Okay,
work.
gender or age stereotype.
Yeah.
But from a systems perspective, go back to Beavers, go back to Olson. How would you capture the idea of roles as a system characteristic? Because that's what I want you to do. What I'm really going to want you to do is take what we learned about the family systems models, particularly Beavers and Olson's, and plug that into here. So structural characteristics would be things like hierarchies of control. So Beavers, power and control, right? Or roles. So in Beaver's model, it would be contextual clarity. Whether people understand what their role is, what their part is in the family, and they fulfill those responsibilities, right? In Olson, it would be how much flexibility there is in the roles. How much flexibility is in their power structures, right? The affective relationships amongst members. So affective responsiveness. Or in Olson, levels of cohesion. How much family members do things together, right? So that would be part of the structural, those all would be things that would be captured under the structural internal context in the stressor model. So if we had to plug in those models, most of it goes into structural part. Psychological are the individual cognitive and affective states of members. So what's the education of the family members? What's the highest level of education of the executive subsystem? Education is an important variable in determining your ability to deal with a stressor event. What's the level of what are the personalities of the members? Is there high levels of anxiety or neuroses amongst these members? Yeah.
Does that also include like their experiences and whatnot, like individual?
It would include their experiences as well. Their experiences that feed into their cognitions, their understandings of life, if you will, right? Or the experiences that shape their affective response to situations. Do they quickly get upset when things go wrong? Do they need everything to be in order, or are they more cool and level-headed? And so that would all fit into the psychological context. What are those psychological characteristics of the members? And then third is the philosophical side of the internal context, and that's the collective values and beliefs. And so the only thing that we would have from our systems models that fits in here would be Beaver's transcendent values, right? But we could take everything that we talked about with the culture and put it in here as well. So those storylines, the narratives, the collective memories, that's all part of this philosophical aspect of the internal context. And so when a family is faced with a stressor event, these are the things that it's going to draw upon in shaping how it views the event, how the family views itself and its ability to deal with the event, and the kinds of resources that the family can utilize to make an adaptation to the event. So can we switch up roles? Do we have role flexibility? Okay. Can we feel confident in separating ourselves enough to deal with the issues in front of us without feeling like we've lost our continuity as a family? Do we have that flexibility in our cohesion? Do we have a sense of autonomy and togetherness, right? And so and then what do we know? How can we make decisions? Does somebody have the knowledge to help us understand what the problem is or what our options are? And so those are important, that would be psychological variables, and then, of course, the philosophical. How do we perceive it? What does this mean in terms of our family life? Do we have a good sense of what we are as a family? Well, if we do, then we're not as challenged. If we don't have a clear sense of who we are as in a family, then it's going to be more difficult for us to focus our attention towards dealing with the issue that's confronting us successfully. And so that's the internal context. Now, the external context involves, as I said, 5 things. Cultural is the dominant values or beliefs of the groups that we associate with as a family. So it's not the culture of the family, it's the culture of the group that our family is embedded in. So you remember we talked about ritual and the transition to parenthood, and I talked about the study of Hispanic Americans, in this case Mexican Americans, and the cultural tradition of la cuarentena, right? What was that about? Well, having that available helps those families adjust to the transition to parenthood. Families from that same cultural group who aren't as well embedded in their cultural group might not deal with that transition as well, especially if they're not embedded in the dominant white group, if they're somewhere in between, if they've been isolated from their group. And if you remember from that research, it was done in Minnesota, in an area that has a pretty large Hispanic population and a pretty well-defined Hispanic cultural community that many of those families, in all likelihood, were very much connected to. And so you're being connected to the cultural group is going, a group that has a set of values and beliefs, that is then going to allow you to sometimes draw upon things that are in that culture to help you make adjustments. And if you're not attached to the group, it might make it more difficult for you to make the adjustment because you don't have those community supports that you're tied into. So that's the cultural context. The historical would be unique stressors in the external environment. So a historical context variable, an example of a good one, is let's say that you were a young family and your child was going to go to school for the first time. Okay. But that year, earlier that year, some madman went into a school in Connecticut and killed all these young children at school. Is that going to make it easier or harder for you to deal with this new stressor event?
Harder.
Harder, right? It's probably going to raise concerns and anxieties. It's probably going to mean that you're going to have to make more changes to reduce those uncertainties, more than you normally would, because of a historical circumstance. Sometimes it's related directly to the stressor, and that this would be a case in point. Other times it might be a more general historical event. So there's a deployment in a military family. Well, what's the historical conditions in the world at that time? Is that deployment likely to be seen as threatening to harm to the life of the person who's being deployed, or not so threatening? What are the tensions in the world at that time? Whether or not they're going to war or not, if there's lots of tensions, it might make it more difficult to adjust to that. Okay, again, that one's another one that's tied directly to the stressor event, right? A general one might be when the attack came in 9/11, when those planes flew into those towers. Generally across the world, or across the United States, even people who didn't live in big cities, a lot of things that would happen in ordinary everyday life all of a sudden become bigger issues because the level of anxiety around what does all this mean gets created, and that makes those new issues become maybe more important, maybe missed or overlooked because the attention is focused on the issues of terrorists and what they're going to do, and so what they're going to do next. And so it could disrupt family functioning and thereby make adjustments to stresses more difficult. So the bottom line here is that there are things that are happening outside of the family. And they're usually one-off kind of things. You lose your job, but you lose your job during the Great Depression or during the recent recession. That makes losing your job a little bit bigger event than if it was during other normal economic times. So that's a historical. Economic is the availability or scarcity of resources. And so this is tied to what is your position in the economic system where you live. So are you middle class, or are you working class? Are you in poverty? Those are external economic contexts. You have a job, but you don't make a lot of money. You don't have a salary. If you miss an hour of work, you miss the pay for that hour of work, as opposed to you have a salary. If you miss an hour of work because you have to deal with a child, so be it. You make it up later. You're going to get paid no matter what. Okay? Big difference, right? So social class fits in here under economic context. And then fourth is developmental. Where is your family in its developmental history? And what has happened in the past? So we can think of this as either inter or intra-generational. So previous developmental things that have happened in your family as it's developed, events that happened in the past can influence how you perceive events today. Events that happened in the past could limit your availability of resources today. And so you have to consider, well, what happened in your family of procreation earlier in its life. But also intergenerational, what happened in your parents' family or your spouse's parents' family. Because those kinds of events many times can cause us to see something that's happening in our family today, sometimes in more catastrophic terms. Oh, here we go again. This happened in my family when I was younger. Okay. My parents got divorced, and now what does that mean in terms of how we're dealing with these issues? And sometimes we take those object lessons, if you will, and we use them to create perceptions of what's happening today. Some research that was done years ago looked at parenting and the paradigms that parents use. And one of the paradigms is, I'm going to parent like my parents parented me. And so the reaction to to an event that might be around parenting, like adjustment to the transition to parenthood, or adjustment to what you're going to do when your children become adolescents, how you're going to react to that, you might, to some degree, it could be influenced by what you experienced when you were young in your family growing up, in your family of orientation. The other kind of paradigm that they use is the opposite one. I'm never going to treat my children like my parents treated me. I'm not going to make my parents' mistake. Or that can be with parenting today, or it could even be with your marriage. I'm not going to make the marital mistakes that my parents made when I was growing up. That kind of a perception can lock you in to a particular form of action, which may or may not be particularly useful for dealing with the stressor event that you're constructing or that you're confronting at the time. And so those would be examples of developmental context. It's basically, developmental is capturing the idea of time. How time provides a context. Past time. What happened in the past? In the family that you currently are in, your family of what we call procreation, or, going further back, the family that you grew up in. Those historical events that are family history, not historical in terms of the world or the nation, but historical in the sense of your family's unique history. That's what we refer to as developmental. And then the final point of the external context is hereditary. So this refers to the genetic capacities and dispositions of individual members. And so another way that your parents are influencing your family today is that you share their genetic composition. And so if you had a parent who was an alcoholic, you're confronting issues in your family today with the knowledge that you carry around with you that potential. And so to the extent that there is a genetic handing off of dispositions or abilities, that's going to either limit or empower you to deal with a stressor event. Okay? Both in terms of how you perceive the event. I have to be careful that I don't do things that are going to lead me to have this genetic capacity come forward that I don't want to, but also in terms of the resources that you have. What are your abilities? You inherited them. You got them from your parents. The parents got them from their parents. And so you have limitations. And so you're always dealing within those limitations. And the family that has a hereditary history of, let's say, lower intelligence or proclivities for certain kinds of disruptive behaviors, those families are going to be more challenged in their ability to manage stressor events than ones that don't have those histories. Okay, the last model takes the ABCX, and we could say the contextual ABCX model. We could take this whole last model and put it in the contextual setting, but it says that there are 2 points in the model, and so it's called the double ABCX model. And so here we have stressor, resources, perceptions, crisis. Certain characteristics of perceptions and resources will determine whether or not a stressor leads to a crisis. Hopefully, you have the right conditions here, and the contextual factors are right, that it creates the right adaptive perceptions and resources, and you don't experience crisis. If you experience crisis, then what? If you experience crisis, can you ever recover? And what's going to determine whether you can recover or not? And so the second part is the post-crisis model. And so there's a double A, a double B, a double C, and a double X. And so you experience the crisis. If you experience crisis as a family, what that means is that things stop working, right? You're not achieving goals, you're not getting by. Things are breaking down. Well, so you didn't recover from the crisis. Let's say a child gets arrested and incarcerated. Right? And you don't have the right perceptions and resources to handle that. And so you get, all of a sudden, the whole family stops working as a unit. The mother is always concerned that the child is going to be, mistreated in jail, and so she goes and takes care of him, makes sure she's in tune, visits the child every day, and ignores her other children and doesn't go to work so she can go visit the child because she's not functioning properly. She's not thinking. She's not tying, oh, I have a family. I can't do all this and manage my family at the same time. And so what happens? The other kids go and get in trouble in school. So now she has to deal with school. And she loses her job. So now she has a crisis of paying her bills. And then they lose their house. So now you've got pileup. That's even worse. So how do you deal with now not just the original stressor event, but now a whole new set because you're not working as a family? And the post-crisis model says, well, the same way you dealt with the stressor event. What you have to do is alter your perceptions, and you have to try to find new resources and use more of your existing ones to the extent that they're still there. And that allows you to then cope with that situation, which then can create either bon adaptation or maladaptation. You either adapt or don't adapt. So let's look a little bit at these elements of the double ABCX. The first is the secondary stressors, pileup of stressors. It's in making adjustments, other stressor events occur. The double B, resources secured after the crisis occurs. So now you know you're in trouble. You need to go seek help. Or someone sees that things are going wrong and they come in and say, hey, you need some help. Here's some resources. And hopefully if you live in the right kind of context, you get that kind of intervention. And so now you start finding, maybe I need another job, or I need a second job, because in order to now deal with the stressor event and keep my family out of crisis, I need to make more money. Develop networks of people. Join a church, or activate your church commitments so that you pull those people in to help you. Seek counseling. Reach out. Go get food stamps. Right? Go to the community development organization in your community. Knock on their door and say, hey, I'm desperate. I need help. And so usually these new resources are things that are coming. They weren't there originally. You have to go out and seek them. Now, what's going to determine whether you can seek them or not? Well, a lot depends on where you live, right? What your social class background is, what the economic situation is in your community. And so that's going to play a role here. Just like it played a role in whether you had the resources to begin with, it also plays a role, let's take social class. Social class plays a role in how well you can adapt to a stressor event, because you have more financial means to handle it. You can take a loan. You can put aside your job, take a leave from your job for a while, because you have savings built up or whatever. Social class also determines whether or not there's access to resources to help you if you're not dealing with the stressor event successfully. Can you go out and find some other source of help? And people live in certain communities. Some communities have lots and lots and lots of things available to them. Other communities have nothing. Some communities have great schools with great school counselors who can be relied upon to help children who are struggling because their families are struggling at home. Other communities have very poor educational systems. They don't even have real teachers in them. They have Teach for America people in them. Lots of schools in New York and Los Angeles, New York City and Los Angeles. Who teaches in those schools? Well, there's some accredited teachers, but a lot of the teaching is being done by people who work for Teach for America. They're not accredited teachers. They're kind of babysitters. In New York City, they hire immigrant laborers because they're willing to go into the classrooms, whereas they can't get a regular person to come and teach. And so that's a very different kind of environment. If you're a family under extreme stress and crisis, you have no one to rely upon in the school systems to help you deal with that. But if you live in some great communities that are out there that have developed those resources, yeah, you're in better shape. I was just talking to a friend of mine. She moved to Dallas from here, Austin. And Austin has a great program to get kids through high school. And they contract with Sylvan Learning Services to provide individual tutors for children in school. So you can imagine how that might facilitate, and this is a lot of minorities are the ones that take advantage of this. And so a lot of these minority families that otherwise don't have resources to help them deal with their children's schooling while they deal with other kinds of issues in their families, they're in much better shape in Austin than they are in other places, because there's tutoring services available for their kids. And they don't have to pay for them. It's a resource that they can take advantage of. And that by put off an additional stressor, and then by allow them, if they're dealing with some other issue in their own family, an alcoholic parent or a kid who gets arrested or something like that, they can focus on that because they can pull from the community resources to help them manage some aspect of their family system, in this case the education and socialization and supervision of their children. And so that's what we're talking about by the double Bs. Are those resources available? In the military families that experience crisis oftentimes, well, first of all, at the original point of view, when a stressor occurs, military families not only have to rely upon just what they have. If they live on a base, they usually have access to services on the base that help support those families to deal with that, what do I want to say, deployment, right? And if they do experience crisis, they have even more resources available to help them, because the military provides that. Actually, one of the very interesting things of the U.S. military is that it's really bolstered its services to families. And in fact, one of the major people who develops and works with these stress models is actually an officer in the Navy, Hamilton McCubbin from the University of Wisconsin. And so he's worked for many decades with the military to help them develop family services, to help soldiers, and not just soldiers, but help the families of soldiers deal with the stressors that come from military life. And then the double C is the perception of the initial event and later impact. So this refers to, okay, it didn't work. We're in crisis. Now, how are we going to get out of it? Well, a perception that's not going to get you out of it is, we're toast. We're done. There's no hope, right? Another perception is, oh, maybe we overreacted. Maybe we should look at this stressor event in a different way. Maybe what happened was we saw it as a challenge or a crisis instead of a challenge. We saw it as something that we couldn't recover from rather than something that we can recover from, or that we're going to be able to show our strengths as a family. And then all of a sudden start turning the corner and coming back as a family group. So this refers to reframing the significance of the event and giving meaning to the crisis. Okay, we're a mess right now, but there's a meaning to this. If you had the right transcendent values, you could say it's a challenge from God. We have an obligation to kind of overcome it. Some families do that. Religion plays that kind of role in families many times. Okay. Next on the double AB6 model is the distinction that's made between coping and adaptation. So in that model, the question is, does the family cope or does it adapt? And this is generally true even in the first part of the model. If it's crisis, then the family is not adapting and not coping at all. Okay? So what we want to know is, when a family experiences a stressor event, what is its reaction? Does it try to keep things as they are? Is it able to kind of sustain itself? Or is it able to change itself in a fundamental way that allows it to go forward and to grow and develop? And that's the difference between coping and adaptation. And so coping is a process of adjustment to a stressor event that involves management of family dynamics and the restoration of equilibrium. So sometimes families try to cope. You're going to see this in the movie that you're going to watch, Ordinary People. This family, when you see it, is coping. And I'll give you one example, but you can look for others, and that's one of your challenges in your review. But they're coping by imagining that their son didn't really drown. Or at least that the son's drowning didn't change anything. And so they're trying to act like he's still there. They never sit down and address the issue with each other. They never talk about it. They try to sustain a sense of still being a family. And as you're going to see, they're not. They're not a functioning one. They're managing. They're getting by. They're preserving the image of being a family. Okay? They're doing things the way they always did them. But doing things the way they always did them doesn't work anymore because Buck isn't there. And so they're coping. not really a great outcome, as you'll see. Later in the movie, they adapt. So now their adaptation, unfortunately, involves, as you'll see, a change in family structure, in this case, the elimination of a member. But the adaptation is an outcome of recovery from stress. It's long-term adjustment through system environment fit. So now, instead of saying, we're just going to keep everything on an even keel, maintain equilibrium, in adaptation, you say, oh, we're going to recognize, we're going to allow relationships to get upset. We're going to permit deviations from the way we always did things. That's adaptation. As soon as you say that, you're saying we're going to try to about new ways of relating to each other. Ways that don't involve the missing member. That would be adaptation. So development of you can do this by developing resources to meet system needs. So finding new ways of doing things so you have more resources to deal with a problem. Or family changes to respond to environmental demands. Making changes in family life, the way you do things, so that you can address the issues that are making it difficult for your family to survive.
Does coping happen first and then adaptation, or is it kind of like you can choose either one?
It doesn't have to. It depends on the family. If a family is more flexible and has the right levels of cohesion, they're more likely to fall into adaptation right away. Okay. If it's more rigid, or those ties are more tenuous, or there's an overemphasis on connectedness, then there's a good chance that they'll fall into coping. Just because you're coping doesn't mean you can't adapt. You could do it in stages, but the key is not staying in the coping stage beyond too long of a period of time. Because the longer you stay in the coping stage, the longer the potential for you to experience a pileup, an accumulation of stressor events. Because you're never going to be able to make a full adaptation to any other stressor that comes along. You're trying to keep things even. And as long as you try to keep things even, you're not going to recognize the points at which you would normally have recognized that you need to make changes. Because any change becomes threatening. The whole system falls down. It's almost a myth. It's almost a pretend state. It's a fantasy world. Because your system isn't functioning at its full capacity. It's functioning at a very low level. Whereas this is, you're making a change. And when you make that change, then that allows you then to go forward. And when you experience new stressors, you don't have to deal with things that you were dealing with in the past. They've already been taken care of. Some key differences, coping is more short-term, adaptation is more sustainable. You can only cope for so long. Coping is more about immediate survival. Adaptation is about long-term livability. We'll cope to get by. When families do that, and probably what happens in this family that you're going to see in Ordinary People, probably because we don't see the family right after the son dies, is probably they engaged in their coping to kind of get through the anguish of losing their oldest son when he was 16 years old. It would be devastating, especially with the kind of connections they had with each other. And so we won't push the issue. We need everybody to kind of deal with their emotions, and we'll try to create an even place for people. So in that sense, let's just get through this because it is so challenging. But you got to get out of that and think, well, can we continue to live in this kind of condition for the rest of our lives? And that's the push to adaptation and long-term livability. Coping is more reactive, adaptation is more planned. To adapt, you usually have to sit down and talk about it. And so remember in Olson's model, adaptation is a lot about the second type of adaptability, right? The second level. And so it involves communication. You have to be able to sit down and talk and plan. You have to think about what's the right strategy going forward. You can't put it on automatic pilot. You can't just do things the way they're always done. That's coping. More reactive. Adaptation is more planned. And then coping is more resource degrading. Adaptation is more resource optimizing. So when you're coping, you're basically drawing on the resources that you have already. The ways of doing things, the kinds of emotional energies that people are putting in. It becomes very draining on the individuals. Their emotional energies get used up because they're trying to hold things together. They're not acting spontaneously. They're not acting in their own best interest. They're not necessarily acting in the best interest of the other person. They're really drawing on their emotional capacities to absorb inadequacy. Whereas if it's an adaptation, it frees people to go and develop new resources, to find more about themselves, psychological resources, for example. It allows them to go and explore new avenues of work, for example, bring more resources into the family. It allows them to explore new ways of acting as a family group, which then might make them more resilient in the future. And so adaptation is always resource optimizing. It maximizes the resources of the individual members, and it maximizes the resources of the family organization itself as a resource. It creates an organization that's more changeable, more flexible. It usually creates more cohesion, not less cohesion. It brings people together trying to solve a problem, which makes people closer. And so it also tends to allow people to have more autonomy if they need it. So it frees them up for that autonomy, which then also becomes important later on in their ability to adapt in future events as a family. And so what you really want is this. Coping, okay for a while, but what you really want is adaptation in the family for its well-being. Finally, the last topic on family stress theory is this idea of what makes families resilient. Or resilience or resiliency in families. And the goal is to try to create families that are resilient in their organization so that they don't experience crises in response to stressor events. And so this term family resilience and family resiliency have been developed. So what is resilience? Walsh, who wrote the chapter that you read on, actually wrote a couple of the chapters that you've read in this course, one on normality of families. She defines resilience as an ability to withstand and rebound from disruptive life changes. So you're resilient if you get knocked down, you get right back up. You have that capacity. You're not resilient if you get knocked down and you just stay down and you just keep on going downward from there. And so this resilience or resiliency is this sort of ability to bounce back, ability to take a blow and either absorb it, or if you get knocked down, to get back up and go forward in dealing with additional life challenges. Patterson, who also is another systems theorist who works in the stress area, says there are two related dimensions with regard to family resilience. One is what he calls resiliency, and that's a capacity to manage challenging life circumstances, making the family resistant to disruptive and adaptive in the face of crisis situations. So it's a capacity that families have such that they don't experience crisis. If I use a prize fighting, a boxing analogy, it's the ability to take a blow and then just keep on going without getting knocked down, without being disrupted in your continued pursuit of your goals. And so that would be a boxer who's fit enough that they can take a hit and they can absorb it and just keep on going forward. It's an initial state that protects generally against crisis and helps families to adapt to crisis if experienced. So usually these kinds of characteristics in families are developed over time. They're usually developed by undergoing milder stressors throughout their lives and having an organization which allows them to deal with those stressors successfully and build into themselves certain characteristics that when new stressors come along that are more serious, they just accept them and bring them in and make adjustments without having to sit down and talk about what's necessary. Or to think about, oh, we're not working, how do we fix things? They never really think about fixing things. They just constantly adapt to changes that they experience. And that's resiliency. Resilience is, instead of a capacity, it's an actual process of making changes. So it's a process involving an interaction between risks and protective factors relative to a specific outcome. It's based on initial resiliency, but also on traits specific to the risk exposed to and traits developed as a result of risk exposure. And so resilience is something that families demonstrate in their day-to-day lives. When the stressor comes along, they successfully adapt to it. To a large degree, that resilience that they demonstrate can be attested to by some general characteristics they have, which define their resiliency. So when you think of resiliency, families have these certain characteristics that make them uniformly able to adapt to situations and stressor events. And here we're talking largely about things that Olson would talk about in terms of cohesion and connectedness and flexibility, or Beavers would talk about in terms of his family competence dimensions. These things generally make a family better able to adapt. But some circumstances, while having those initial characteristics might increase your chances of showing or demonstrating resilience, certain other characteristics may be necessary for the resilience to actually happen in those situations given the nature of the stressor event. And so, for example, it might be useful to have very clear hierarchical decision-making structures and clear boundaries between the sibling and the parent subsystem. Generally, that all families, that enhances their resiliency to stressor events, or having a lot of flexibility and high levels of cohesion. Sometimes, though, a stressor event requires a shifting of family organization in a way that would not fit with the model of what resiliency is, but for that particular situation is resilient. And so that's why it's a process and it involves an interaction between what's the risk factor, what are the stressor event, the nature of that stressor event, and what are the special characteristics that families need to develop given that specific stressor event. Probably a good example of this would come from studies of the military. So, Alex, you're doing military, right? So I'll get all your things done by this evening, but one of the things that you're probably going to find is that there are certain characteristics maybe of military families when dealing with deployments that might challenge the idea of maybe a very clear hierarchy or clear boundaries between the parent and the child subsystems, that there might need to be some connections between the parent and the children when the second parent's gone to facilitate the continued incorporation of that missing parent who's deployed in the family system. And so there may be things that make these families not look like the ideal family, but given their circumstances, works for them and works for those circumstances. So we might expect a military family not to look like the model of the ideal functional family. We might expect a police family not to look like the model of the ideal family. There may be some very special elements of their situation that make deviations from what normally would be considered a resilient family in order to actually demonstrate their resilience. And that's all Patterson is talking about here. In general, resilience, the things that make families resilient in the sense of resiliency, having that capacity, they generally translate. But there may be special circumstances that lead to some aspects of family dynamics creating more resilience for those particular families in those particular circumstances. And that's all that this distinction is trying to capture. Some key processes in family resiliency, first is belief systems. They play a big role in resiliency in families. How we make meaning of adversity. How do we interpret this adversity? Is it, oh my goodness, it means that we don't work as a family, or we're dysfunctional, or do we see this adversity as something like a challenge, something that our ability to show that we are a solid family? That would be making meaning of the adversity. It's God testing us is a good example of making meaning of the adversity. Taking a relational view versus a shared, taking a relational view in a shared challenge. This is an opportunity for us to be closer. Someone got sick, and now it's, we were kind of drifting apart. Let's take the opportunity to be closer. And we're all in this together. That's the idea of a shared challenge. Normalizing and contextualizing distress is another way that we make meaning of adversity. What are the normalizing would be, this isn't unusual. Other families have done this. They've gone through this. And that would be one way of normalizing the event. Connecting yourself to the idea that, oh, it's not just us, which means it's not something wrong with us. We're part of a society in which this happens a lot, and not all families fall apart because of this. And that would be a normalizing kind of strategy. Understanding extenuating circumstances. Okay? It wasn't us that caused this to happen. There were extenuating circumstances that came into play here that caused us to be in this situation. And so we can respond to it. And then interpreting disruptions as part of the process. That, look, this is disrupting us. We're not all working together in the right way, but that's okay. That's temporary. It's part of the process of trying to find a new solution, a new way of relating with each other. Accepting deviations as opportunities to change, as opposed to being upset that things aren't being done the way they've always been done. Maintaining a sense of coherence, comprehending the challenge and interpreting it as manageable. So we know what we have to do. We have a clear sense of what is the problem that needs to be fixed, and let's start working on it, on the elements of that problem. And then making facilitative appraisals, understanding the causes of disruption and means for addressing those causes. Also maintaining a positive outlook. This includes developing an optimistic appraisal and maintaining hope. We can get through it. Developing positive illusions. Perceiving that you are a functioning family. Perceiving that you do have good relationships with each other. Even if, in reality, at the time, it doesn't look that way. That we do get along, even though there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of conflict going on. But that's unusual. It's not what we are. We really, I'm going to kind of dismiss those instances and focus on all those positive things that show that we agree on things, not that we are in conflict. That we are together, not that we're all dispersed and individualized and isolated. So it's accenting the positive, and they're illusions in the sense that we're kind of denying a little bit of the negatives that are happening amongst us. But we're not in denial that there's a problem going on, that there's something that has to be fixed. And so we're not dwelling on the things that are negative. We know that there are negative instances, but we're seeing them as not tied to the overall characterization of what we are as a family group. And so that's this idea of developing positive illusions. Maintaining high levels of encouragement, affirmation of family strengths, and recognition of new competencies. So a lot of affirmation of individual members and the things that they're trying to do, even if they're not working, giving people credit for trying things out, experimenting with new behaviors, and then taking initiative and maintaining a culture of perseverance. So encouraging people to try new things. As a family, attempting new ways of trying to create family or to address a problem, even if maybe they don't work out, saying, well, that was a try, we'll go on to something else. But we're going to keep on trying at it. Perseverance is a really interesting term, right? We know this about students. Students persevere or they don't in college. We call it persistence. You know, you might get knocked down, but you keep on trying. You try something else. It might not work, so you try something else. And you keep on working at it, and that allows you then to find new solutions. And then mastering the possible and accepting the impossible. Choosing things that you can do. And taking care of those, and letting things that you have no control over, letting those go. Instead of saying, well, okay, well, we can't fix everything at one time, but we can address these problems, and here's clear steps along the way that allow us to do that. And then a transcendent spirituality, transcendence in spirituality is part of the belief system that enhances resiliency, focusing on larger values and a sense of purpose beyond the now, engaging in spiritual practices and rituals, finding inspiration to explore new potentials. So using this sense that we are a together family that's tied to a larger set of goals and principles in life, that we believe in certain kinds of things, we practice, and then practicing rituals that reinforce those understandings of who we are. That continues to maintain that sense of cohesion in the family group, just as we talked about when we talked about rituals, this importance of rituals in terms of maintaining cohesion. Organizational patterns, flexibility, openness to change, maintaining stability and continuity, strong authoritative leadership. So there's a difference between authoritative leadership and authoritarian leadership, right? Authoritarian leadership is kind of cold and you tell people what to do. Authoritative leadership is you're the one in charge and everyone knows that, but you're warm, you accept the inputs of others that you have authority over, and you make decisions within that context. Development of varied family forms, so being willing to bring other people into the family or making decisions that maybe someone should be excluded from the family in order to deal with the crisis, and strong couple co-parental relationships. So a strong marriage system is really critical to this flexibility. Connectedness is also important, so mutual support, collaboration, and commitment, respect for individual needs and differences, and strong motivation to repair and improve relationships. So you need to have this togetherness, but you also have to have respect for each other's autonomy and their individual differences. This allows people to then have that freedom to move within the system, but it also makes people motivated in their freedom to act on behalf of each other and the family as a group. And then finally, high levels of social and economic resources. The more things that you have available financially and socially, the kinds of networks that you have as a family really go a long way in making you more resilient as a family, increasing your resiliency. Finally, communication and problem-solving patterns, and this is, where are we finding this from, right? Most of this is coming out of Olson's model, right? And so, clear and consistent messaging between members, open emotional expression. People feel free to talk about their concerns and their issues that they're experiencing, both positive and negative, and they do it in a way in which it doesn't create conflict. Collaborative problem solving, which involves openness to the inputs of others, shared decision making, negotiation, and fairness. Decisions focused on goals directed towards the challenge. So you're making decisions, and those decisions have justification in the sense that, okay, we've got something that we're confronting. And so we might be deciding to allocate resources for this aspect of dealing with that issue, and we're going to have to put on hold something else that is more secondary now. So changing the priorities in terms of what are the basis for our decisions. And then taking a proactive stance, considering future possibilities and challenges and making changes to accommodate them before they occur. So saying, okay, this was the beginning, maybe we were caught by surprise, but we're not going to get caught by surprise again. We're going to be ready for these kinds of challenges when they happen again.